Today we're going to carry on from the video that we did last week with the showing about shading on the onion, and we were just talking about that, doing it in pencil and doing it in black and white. Today we're going to have a look at the colour. So I've done this onion again just in ink, but obviously a waterproof ink, and just quite a simple line drawing of the onion. And before I started the video, I've put some masking fluid on where I want the highlights. So basically the masking fluid preserves the white of the paper so that we're not worrying about drawing around it or anything. So it's a Winsor & Newton masking fluid, and I've applied it using this what's called a colour shaper. And the thing about this is it's a rubber tip, so the masking fluid just comes off it quite easily. You just get a bit of tissue or something and wipe it off it, whereas with your brushes it can sort of spoil your brushes if you're not careful. So that's what I use for applying it, and you can get different sizes of these and different shapes. Oops, and I've dripped on the paper there as well. Okay, so I'll pop that to one side. The other thing about masking fluid is I'm sure you can see it there, but if you're worried about not being able to see it as your painting goes on, you can actually buy a coloured one. So you could buy a blue one if you like. Okay, so thinking about building up the shadows on this onion, obviously we've already got the highlights there with the masking fluid, so we don't need to worry about that. So the whole thing, to begin with, I'm looking at the colours in it, and I think I'm going to put a layer of yellow ochre over the whole thing to begin with, and then gradually build it up the tones. So in watercolour we work from the lightest to the darkest. So I've got plenty of water in there, so it's quite a thin mixture with the yellow ochre. And I'm just going to cover the whole thing, apart from obviously the masking fluid. And then once we've done that, I'm going to leave that to dry completely. Okay, now that's dry, I'm going to start building up the mid-tones. So like I said, with watercolours we're going from the lightest to the darkest, the lightest being the paper, and the darkest is what we'll finish off with, probably with these shadows underneath. So I'm actually going to just do another layer of the same colour, but this time I'm going to have a bit more pigment and a bit less water, so it'll be a thicker version of the same colour. And whilst you're putting your colours on and thinking about the shadows, also think about the drawing of the onion itself. So pick up some of the shapes. Now starting to think about leaving some of that underneath colour for where the highlights are, and where it's at the darkest, don't need to leave any at all. So again, like we said about when we're doing our pencil work, move in the direction of the object that you're drawing. You can start and you can correct your drawing with your paint if you like as well, if there's some more lines that you need to add, a bit more drawing that you want to do. And as always with these things, you have a lot more time to get a bit more detail in. And to go darker, we're now going to add a little bit of blue. So I'm going to go for a French ultramarine, and again I'm not adding any more water. Here there's lots of little bits of shadow where this papery top of the onion is casting shadows on itself, where it's all folding over. But again, don't get bogged down in worrying about every little crease being in the right place. Just get that impression. Here, this is where this outside piece is casting a shadow on itself as well. And down here, along that edge. And don't forget, as you're applying this, that these watercolours are going to dry lighter than they're going on. So this is one thing beginners do quite often, is be over cautious about how dark they're going with the watercolours. And I've just gone over that a bit too much, more than I would like, this piece here where there's a tear in the skin. So I'm just going to, whilst it's wet, lift some of that out with my brush. So this is another thing you can do to get some highlights back that you've lost, is just use your brush. And again, that helps to shape the onion as well. So whilst I've got that mix there, I'm going to just add some more water to that. I'll add a tiny little bit of the sienna and yellow ochre as well to lighten it up a bit. And I'm going to put some of the shadows underneath in now. And make sure you touch the object. The shadows aren't separate to the object, so touching it. And now I'm going to get a thicker mix again of the sienna, the ultramarine, and this time I'm going to add a touch of Payne's grey to go slightly darker. And we'll have this as the final dark colour, so just where the darkest shadows are. And just dropping that into the wet paint. And I'll just soften that edge off with a bit of a damp brush there as well. And bring that shadow out. Okay, and then I'm going to leave that to completely dry and come back to that when it's dry. Okay, so now what you can do once it's dry is, if you do want to add more detail, get a much smaller brush and add the paint much more thickly, maybe even straight from the pan, just to get some of those shapes in. So here's some of the yellow ochre, and this is something you could spend quite a bit of time doing. Get some of those lines. But be careful not to lose all your highlights. Of course, we've still got the masking fluid on there, still protecting that area. It's just quite nice to pick some of those lines out. Make a bit more of the shape of this onion. And some of the sienna, get some of these dark shapes underneath. And because watercolour is transparent, you've still got your other colours showing through. Just a case of tightening up your drawing. So again, how much detail you do with a smaller brush is entirely up to you. We've still got those lines coming through of the pen, so that's still showing us where the line of the onion's going. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. But if you wanted to get more of these papery bits in and a lot more detail, you could do. So now it's completely dry, I'm going to take off this masking fluid. So if you just use, I like to use my finger, you can use an eraser, but if you use your finger you can feel where the masking fluid is, so you don't miss taking any off, because as you run your finger over the paper you'll feel if there are any rough bits where there's any that you've missed. So just keep going over, and obviously it goes without saying that you need clean hands to do that. And then when you've done that you might think, well actually those highlights are a bit too sharp in places, and you might just go back and get a light mix of the first colour that we had with your smaller brush of the yellow ochre and plenty of water, and you might just want to sort of smooth the edges off some of those or pop a line through them just to make them not just as harsh as they are, a bit more contrast. So leaving the white, but you know, just doing a bit of extra drawing with your brush. So really, to get the shadows in there, all we've done is gone darker and darker with the colours that are in the onion, so making a stronger concentration. Another thing you can do is use a completely different colour, because of course we don't have to do the colours in the object in front of us, we could alter it. So lilac would be quite nice to go with yellow. Now, so you might want to leave it at that, completely leave it. Or just to show you how, another way I would do a shadow is to put a wash over the top of perhaps a lilac, but very, very dilute. And you have to be quite careful doing this. And just look at where the main shadows are, so all this area here. It needs to be a bit stronger, a bit less water in there. And when you put in a glaze over, this is what we call a glaze, when you put in a glaze over, just be careful that you don't lift the colours underneath, so do it quite gently. And just putting this in the darkest areas. But it's a nice colour, it's on the opposite side of the colour wheel is the lilac is to the orangey colours we've got in this onion. So it gives it a really nice feel to the whole painting. And again, if you wanted to, you could use it in your shadows underneath. So that's another way of doing it, is use a completely different colour, a contrasting colour. I'm just going to use a damp brush to merge that in a little bit. And you could, if you wanted, soften the edges of that, but I actually quite like it. I think I'm going to leave that as it is. Now whether you wanted to do a background or not, I'm not sure. I think I would be tempted to leave it at the moment. Okay, so blue is a good colour for shadows, and so is lilac. So just have a play, see what works well for you. So either go stronger with the same colour to get darker tones in there, or perhaps use a completely different colour lilac, like the lilac there, that's perhaps something on the opposite side of the colour wheel. And when you're painting wet in wet and you feel that you've lost some of your highlights, you can always get them back with a damp brush, just by lifting them out. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. If you've got any questions, if you want to pop those in the comments below, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, enjoy your painting, and you know, keep having a little go with some simple objects like this to help you build up your confidence. And like I said in the previous video, once you've done one object on its own, an onion or an apple or whatever, then perhaps have a go at making a little group, a few different things. Onion, garlic's a nice one to draw, mushrooms are nice to draw, anything like that. It's really good drawing practice, things that you've got in the house, pop in front of you and have a go at both drawing and painting them. Okay, so thanks for watching, and bye for now.